Elaine Winters wasn't just a reclusive, 68-year-old woman who had been quietly tending to 85 acres of Vermont apple orchards for nearly 3 decades. She was Eleanor Whitfield, a brilliant former forensic scientist who had single-handedly solved the infamous Lakeside Strangler case that had terrorized the New England coast in the 1980s. The discovery would transform the sleepy farming community of Willow Creek, Vermont, population 612, and reveal a story of intellectual courage, personal sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to justice that redefined what it means to dedicate one's life to truth, even when the world has forgotten. Before we jump back tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elaine Winters appeared in Willow Creek on a crisp September morning in 1994, driving a weathered Subaru station wagon loaded with cardboard boxes of books, scientific journals, and exactly 2 suitcases of personal belongings. She arrived at the neglected Harrington orchard that had been sitting vacant for 3 seasons after Old Henry Harrington passed away without heirs. The 85-acre property, with its aging farmhouse and hundreds of apple trees in various states of neglect, had been listed for sale at a price that reflected its deteriorating condition and the challenging economic realities of small-scale agriculture in the modern era. For $178,000, paid in full with a certified bank check that raised eyebrows at the local credit union, Elaine purchased what most locals considered a burden rather than an opportunity. The orchard required extensive rehabilitation, the farmhouse needed significant repairs, and the economics of apple farming had become increasingly difficult as consolidated agricultural operations and global competition pushed prices down while costs continued to rise. She didn't even try to negotiate the price, Martha Donovan, the real estate agent who handled the transaction, would later recall. She walked the property for exactly 90 minutes, inspecting the trees and soil with a level of attention I'd never seen before, asked about water rights and local ordinances, and then simply said she would take it. No contingencies, no inspection period, just a straightforward purchase with immediate occupancy. For nearly 3 decades, Elaine became the definition of a dedicated orchardist, rising before dawn to tend to her trees, working from first light until dusk during harvesting and pruning seasons, and transforming what had been a failing operation into one of the most productive apple orchards in 3 counties. Her crimson gold and heritage varieties became sought after by specialty markets throughout New England, commanding premium prices for their exceptional flavor and quality, despite her minimal interaction with customers or the broader agricultural community. What made Elaine's presence in Willow Creek unusual wasn't just her success in revitalizing the orchard, but her almost complete social isolation. She spoke only when absolutely necessary, limiting her interactions to brief, efficient exchanges at the general store, the farm supply cooperative, or the farmer's market where she sold her apples, through a local distributor who handled all customer interactions on her behalf. Her farmhouse, a 2-story colonial built in 1892, remained largely unchanged from the outside, with peeling white paint and a front porch that seemed perpetually on the verge of collapse. She made no cosmetic improvements that would be visible to passers-by, creating the impression of a property in continued decline despite the orchard's remarkable productivity. But those few who had occasion to enter her home, primarily the local handyman she hired for essential repairs, reported a different reality behind the weathered exterior. The inside was like something from another world, Jacob Miller, the only local contractor Elaine would allow on her property, explained years later. Every wall was lined with bookshelves filled with technical volumes on chemistry, biology, criminal justice, and forensic science. One room was set up like a small laboratory with microscopes, specialized lighting, and equipment I couldn't begin to identify. She always met me outside and directed me to whatever needed fixing, But on the 2 occasions when I had to enter to address plumbing issues, I saw enough to realize she wasn't just an ordinary farmer. The property that Elaine had purchased came with several outbuildings in various states of disrepair. A large barn that had once housed livestock and farm equipment, a smaller storage shed near the main house, and a detached garage that had been used for equipment maintenance and repair. Within months of her arrival, Elaine had contracted with a construction company from Burlington, specifically requesting workers, who weren't local to Willow Creek, to renovate the barn into what she described as a research and storage facility for agricultural purposes. The renovation included specialized ventilation systems, enhanced electrical capacity that seemed excessive for typical farm operations, reinforced security features including commercial-grade locks and a sophisticated alarm system, and interior modifications that created separate workspaces with specialized infrastructure that seemed unnecessary for apple production or storage. The construction was completed in just under 3 months, after which no one from Willow Creek was ever invited. Inside, Sheriff Thomas Brennan, who had served as Willow Creek's primary law enforcement officer for over 20 years, had made it a practice to welcome newcomers to the community, with a brief visit to introduce himself and provide information about local services and emergency procedures. His visit to Elaine's farm 3 weeks after her arrival was the first indication that she wasn't typical of the region's agricultural community. "She met me at the edge of the driveway," Sheriff Brennan would later recall. "Wouldn't invite me onto the property, much less into the house. Answered my questions with minimal responses, clearly communicating that my presence wasn't welcome without explicitly asking me to leave. I remember thinking she seemed more suspicious than shy, like someone who had something to hide rather than someone who was simply private by nature." Brennan's instincts as a law enforcement officer had prompted him to run a basic background check on Elaine Winters after that unusual encounter. The results had been unremarkable but oddly incomplete. She had a driver's license issued in Maine 3 years earlier, a clean driving record, no criminal history, and tax records showing minimal income from investments, just enough to suggest someone living modestly on savings. But there was a conspicuous absence of history before the previous decade, no property ownership, employment records, or educational background that would explain her apparent expertise in agriculture or the scientific equipment Jacob Miller had noticed in her home. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Something didn't add up," Brennan admitted years later, but there was nothing actionable, no reason to dig deeper. Plenty of people come to rural Vermont looking for privacy and a fresh start, without cause for investigation, respecting that privacy is part of the job. For the residents of Willow Creek, Elaine's reclusiveness became simply another facet of local character in a region where independence and self-sufficiency were respected traits. The community had experienced significant changes over the previous decades as traditional agricultural operations became less viable. Young people moved away seeking economic opportunities in larger cities, and the population gradually declined and aged. Located in the northeastern corner of Vermont, approximately 40 miles from the Canadian border, and nestled between rolling hills that turned spectacularly colorful each autumn, Willow Creek had once been a thriving agricultural community with dozens of family farms producing dairy, apples, maple syrup, and mixed vegetables. By the time Elaine arrived in 1994, economic pressures had reduced the number of operating farms to less than 20, with many original homesteads converted to vacation properties or purchased by retirees seeking rural tranquility. The town center consisted of a small cluster of buildings surrounding a traditional New England green, Wilson's General Store, which had been operated by the same family for 4 generations. The Willow Creek Community Church, a white clapboard building with a tall steeple that hosted services for 3 different Protestant denominations on rotating Sundays. The volunteer fire department housed in a modern metal building that contrasted with the colonial architecture surrounding it. And the town hall, which contained municipal offices, the local library, and a community meeting room that hosted everything from town meetings to quilting circles. What had once been Milligan's Hardware had closed in 1988, leaving an empty storefront that various entrepreneurs had attempted to revitalize as a cafe, craft shop, and most recently, a small museum celebrating the town's agricultural heritage, none of which had generated enough revenue to remain viable. The elementary school had been consolidated with neighboring communities in 1990, requiring children to travel 18 miles by bus to the regional school, a change that had accelerated the exodus of young families from the area. The community's social life centered around Wilson's General Store, where residents gathered to collect mail. There was no home delivery in the outlying areas, purchase necessities, and exchange information about everything from weather forecasts to local health concerns. The store maintained a bulletin board where community members could post notices about services offered, items for sale, and upcoming events, the analog equivalent of social media in a town where internet access remained limited and cellular service was unreliable at best. Robert Wilson, the current proprietor, had taken over management from his father in 1985 and had transformed the traditional general store into a hybrid operation that served both local residents and the growing tourist population that visited Vermont for its famous fall foliage, winter skiing, and increasingly popular agricultural tourism that drew urban visitors seeking authentic rural experiences. The store stocked everything from basic groceries and farming supplies to locally produced crafts, specialty foods, and Vermont-themed souvenirs. It also housed the town's only restaurant, a small cafe area with 6 tables where locals gathered for morning coffee and simple meals prepared by Robert's wife, Diane, whose baking skills had become legendary throughout the region. Elaine came in exactly once a week, always on Tuesday mornings when the store was least busy, Robert Wilson explained. She had a standard list of items, basic groceries, household supplies, the Burlington newspaper, and scientific journals that I special ordered for her. She never deviated from the list, never browsed, and never lingered to chat. Paid in cash, declined receipts, and carried her own canvas bags years before that became common practice. In 28 years, I don't think she ever initiated a conversation beyond the absolutely necessary exchange of information. Despite her reclusiveness, Elaine gradually developed a reputation for extraordinary expertise in apple cultivation. Her rehabilitation of the Harrington orchard had been methodical and scientifically rigorous, based on soil analysis, careful selection of varieties suited to local conditions, and innovative approaches to pest management that minimized chemical interventions while maximizing fruit quality and yield. Word of her expertise spread through the regional agricultural community as her apples began winning awards at state fairs and gaining recognition from specialty buyers who supplied high-end restaurants and markets throughout New England. When insect infestations or unusual plant diseases affected other orchards in the region, their owners would sometimes approach Elaine for advice, drawn by her results despite her well-known preference for solitude. She never turned anyone away who had a legitimate agricultural problem, explained James Hawkins, whose family had operated a nearby orchard for 3 generations. She didn't invite you in for coffee or engage in small talk, but she would walk your orchard with you, identify the problem with remarkable precision, and provide detailed, typewritten instructions for addressing it. Her solutions worked better than anything the Agricultural Extension Service recommended, but she refused any payment or even expressions of gratitude. It was like the information itself was what mattered to her, not the human connection. This pattern of exceptional knowledge combined with deliberate social distance characterized all of Elaine's interactions with the community. When the regional agricultural cooperative held meetings to discuss market conditions, regulatory changes, or collective purchasing opportunities. Elaine would attend but sit in the back, take detailed notes, and leave immediately when the formal proceedings concluded, avoiding the social interaction that most members considered equally valuable. When the volunteer fire department conducted a fundraising drive to purchase new equipment, Elaine sent a generous check by mail rather than attending the community dinner that accompanied the campaign. When severe weather threatened a region, she prepared more thoroughly than anyone else, clearly understanding meteorological patterns and potential impacts with a level of sophistication that suggested professional training or obsessive study. What most residents of Willow Creek didn't know was that the quiet woman who grew exceptional apples while avoiding human connection had designed her life with the same scientific precision she applied to her orchard. Every aspect of her daily, routine living situation and limited social interaction had been carefully constructed to conceal her true identity and history, while allowing her to continue the work that had consumed her professional life before she disappeared from her previous existence. The farmhouse that appeared neglected from the outside had been strategically modified within to serve as both a comfortable living space and a research facility. The kitchen, while appearing outdated with its 1970s appliances and worn countertops, contained commercial-grade equipment carefully selected for precision and reliability rather than appearance. The living room, visible from the front windows, maintained the appearance of modest rural comfort with its simple furniture and wood-burning stove. But hidden behind built-in bookshelves was a climate-controlled room containing computer equipment, specialized forensic reference materials, and communication systems that connected to law enforcement databases through encrypted channels. The second floor, which contained her bedroom and what appeared to be guest rooms that never hosted visitors, had been reconfigured to include a secure storage area for evidence and documentation related to her ongoing work. The basement, accessible only through a reinforced door concealed behind what appeared to be a standard pantry, housed her primary laboratory, a fully equipped forensic workspace with capabilities that would have impressed professionals at the FBI's renowned crime lab in Quantico. The barn that had been renovated immediately after her arrival contained additional research space, specialized equipment for analyzing evidence that couldn't be accommodated in the house, and a comprehensive archive of case materials that documented decades of investigation into a series of murders that had officially remained unsolved for nearly 40 years. Elaine's daily routine reflected the same careful balance between maintaining her cover as a reclusive orchardist and continuing the forensic work that had been her true life's purpose. She rose at 4:30 each morning, beginning her day with a systematic review of overnight communications from the network of law enforcement contacts, who were the only people aware of her true identity and ongoing work. She would spend 2 hours updating case files, analyzing new information, and preparing communications before beginning the agricultural work that maintained her cover and financial independence. From 7 a.m. until dusk, she was every bit the dedicated farmer that her neighbors believed her to be. The orchard's exceptional productivity wasn't a pretense. She had applied her scientific training and meticulous attention to detail to agricultural challenges with the same intensity she brought to forensic investigation, developing genuine expertise and innovative approaches that had transformed the failing operation into a model of sustainable fruit production. After completing each day's agricultural work, Elaine would return to her forensic research, often working late into the night analyzing evidence, reviewing case files, and communicating with the small network of trusted law enforcement professionals who had continued to consult her expertise long after her official identity had been obscured. She maintained the most extraordinary operational security I've ever encountered outside of intelligence agencies, FBI Special Agent Marcus Hernandez would later explain to investigators. Her communications were encrypted, her movements predictable, enough to avoid attracting attention but varied enough to prevent pattern analysis, and her cover identity was supported by meticulous documentation and consistent behavior that never raised red flags. She created a life that allowed her to continue her work while remaining invisible to the people who had threatened her original identity. The threats that had forced Elaine Winters to abandon her previous life had emerged from the same case that had consumed her professional attention for decades. As Eleanor Whitfield, she had been one of the most respected forensic scientists in the northeastern United States, specializing in trace evidence analysis and crime scene reconstruction for complex cases that standard investigative methods had failed to resolve. Her work had contributed to hundreds of successful prosecutions throughout her 20-year career with the Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory, establishing a reputation for meticulous analysis and unimpeachable testimony that made her a sought-after expert witness and consultant for difficult cases throughout New England. The case that would eventually force her into hiding began in 1982, when the body of 22-year-old Sarah Mitchell was discovered near Lakeside Park in Western Massachusetts. The murder initially appeared to be the work of a sexual predator. The victim had been strangled, her body posed in a distinctive manner, and trace evidence suggested a particular ritual had been followed before and after the killing. Local investigators had pursued standard leads without success, eventually requesting assistance from the State Crime Lab, where Eleanor Whitfield was developing new approaches to forensic analysis. Over the next 3 years, 4 more victims were discovered in similar circumstances across Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. The killer, dubbed the Lakeside Strangler by regional media, appeared to be selecting victims carefully, leaving minimal evidence, and operating across jurisdictional boundaries that complicated investigative coordination and evidence sharing. As the primary forensic scientist assigned to the connected cases, Eleanor had identified subtle patterns in trace evidence that suggested the killer had specialized knowledge of forensic methods and was deliberately avoiding established investigative protocols. More concerning, her analysis pointed toward connections to law enforcement or the criminal justice system. The killer understood police procedures well enough to anticipate and counter standard investigative approaches. Her work on the Lakeside cases was revolutionary, explained Dr. Catherine Morgan, former director of the Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory. She developed new approaches to fiber analysis, new protocols for evidence collection and preservation, and new methods for reconstructing crime scene sequences that are now standard practice throughout the forensic community. But more importantly, she recognized connections between seemingly unrelated details that eventually identified the killer, a person whose position had protected them from suspicion for years. What Eleanor discovered through her methodical analysis was that the Lakeside murders were connected to a prominent judge whose family had deep political connections throughout New England. Judge William Prescott had presided over numerous high-profile cases, maintained relationships with law enforcement leadership across multiple jurisdictions, and had been mentioned as a potential nominee for the federal bench, positions that had placed him above suspicion and protected him from the scrutiny that Eleanor's evidence suggested was warranted. When Eleanor presented her findings to the multi-jurisdictional task force investigating the murders, the response had been immediate and disturbing. Her evidence was deemed inconclusive, her methodology questioned despite its rigor, and her conclusions dismissed as speculative by supervisors who had previously championed her innovative approaches. Within weeks, she was reassigned to different cases, her access to the Lakeside evidence restricted, and her professional reputation subtly undermined through administrative reviews and questions about her objectivity. They didn't fire her outright. That would have been too obvious, Dr. Morgan explained. Instead, they implemented a systematic campaign to discredit her work, limit her effectiveness, and eventually force her resignation. The pressure came from multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting coordination at high levels. When she refused to back down or modify her conclusions, The tactics escalated from professional obstruction to personal intimidation. The intimidation began with anonymous phone calls and surveillance of her home, escalated to break-ins where nothing was taken, but evidence of intrusion was deliberately left as warning, and culminated in an apparent attempt on her life disguised as a car accident. Her vehicle's brake lines had been cut in a manner that would appear as mechanical failure rather than sabotage. The message was clear. Her continued pursuit of the case would result in her death. Rather than abandon her investigation or compromise her professional integrity, Eleanor Whitfield made the extraordinary decision to disappear completely, creating a new identity that would allow her to continue her work beyond the reach of those who had tried to silence her. With the help of a small group of trusted colleagues who shared her commitment to justice, she orchestrated her apparent death in a hiking accident in the White Mountains, complete with planted evidence and witness statements that established her demise convincingly enough to terminate the threats against her. Using documentation created through law enforcement connections who believed in her work, she established her new identity as Elaine Winters, relocated to rural Vermont, and created a life that would allow her to continue investigating the Lakeside murders while remaining invisible to those who had tried to prevent her from exposing the truth. She chose apple farming deliberately, explained Special Agent Hernandez. It required significant physical labor in an outdoor setting where surveillance would be obvious, provided legitimate income through a cash business that wouldn't generate suspicions about her financial resources, and created a plausible explanation for her reclusiveness. Many small-scale farmers are known for their independence and preference for solitude. Most importantly, it allowed her to maintain a predictable routine in a location where any unusual presence would be immediately noticed by the close-knit rural community. For 28 years, Elaine Winters maintained her cover identity while continuing to gather evidence, analyze forensic details, and build a case that would eventually expose not just the Lakeside Strangler, but a network of protection that had allowed the killings to continue and the perpetrator to remain free despite compelling evidence of his guilt. The journal she maintained throughout those decades documented both her agricultural work and her ongoing investigation, a meticulous record of scientific methodology applied to two seemingly unrelated fields that demonstrated the same brilliant analytical mind addressing different categories of problems with identical rigor and attention to detail. She never stopped being a forensic scientist, Dr. Morgan would later explain. She just applied those same skills to apple production while continuing her true work in secret. The orchard provided both cover and purpose during a period when patience was her most important investigative tool. She was playing a very long game, gathering evidence systematically while waiting for the right moment to reveal what she had discovered. That moment would come in a way that no one in Willow Creek could have anticipated, transforming their understanding of the quiet woman who had lived among them for nearly 3 decades while harboring one of the most extraordinary secrets in the history of American criminal justice. To understand how Elaine Winters maintained her extraordinary double life for nearly 3 decades, one must understand both the community that unwittingly protected her and the careful balance she maintained between necessary visibility and strategic isolation. Willow Creek, Vermont wasn't just any rural farming community. It was an ideal environment for someone seeking to disappear in plain sight while continuing work that required privacy, security, and occasional connection to outside resources. The region's agricultural heritage had created a culture that respected competence and self-sufficiency, while accepting personal eccentricity as a natural aspect of rural character. Farmers who preferred solitude weren't viewed with suspicion, but rather understood as individuals who communicated through their work rather than social interaction. Elaine's exceptional agricultural results earned her a form of respect that didn't require friendship or personal disclosure. Her apple spoke for her in a community that valued tangible results over social graces. Vermont has a long tradition Of respecting privacy, explained Margaret Caldwell, who had taught local history at the regional high school for over 30 years, before retiring to document the area's cultural evolution. Our state motto is freedom and unity. We understand that individual liberty and community support aren't contradictory but complementary. Elaine represented an extreme version of that independence, but not so extreme that it triggered genuine concern. She was unusual but not unique in her preference for solitude. This cultural context allowed Elaine to maintain minimal social contact, while avoiding the suspicion that complete isolation might have generated. Her weekly visits to Wilson's General Store were perfectly calibrated to demonstrate normalcy without encouraging relationship development. She would arrive at precisely 8:45 each Tuesday morning, when the early coffee crowd had departed, but before the lunch customers arrived, limiting potential interactions while maintaining predictable visibility. That prevented concerns about her welfare. She never varied her routine, Robert Wilson recalled. Same time, same shopping list with minimal seasonal adjustments, same brief but not impolite interactions. She'd ask about product availability, listen to any necessary store announcements, about road closures or power outages, and occasionally respond to direct questions about her orchard if customers expressed interest in her apples. She never initiated personal conversations, but wasn't overtly rude when others did. She'd just redirect the discussion to agricultural topics or practical matters, and then efficiently conclude the interaction. This careful balance extended to her participation in community structures and local governance. Elaine attended town meetings where issues affecting agricultural zoning or water rights were discussed, contributed appropriately to community emergency funds after natural disasters, and complied meticulously with all local regulations and tax obligations. She voted in every election but never discussed political positions or controversial issues, maintaining civic participation at precisely the level that would prevent her from becoming either invisible or noteworthy. Her financial management demonstrated similar strategic thinking. The orchard generated sufficient income to support her modest lifestyle and research activities without requiring external employment that might create additional visibility or scrutiny. She maintained accounts at the regional credit union rather than the local bank where financial discussions were often shared as community news, drove to different towns on a rotating schedule when purchasing specialized equipment or supplies, and conducted any research-related financial transactions through carefully structured channels that couldn't be connected to her Willow Creek identity. Her operational security was masterful, explained FBI Special Agent Hernandez. She understood that in small communities, unusual spending patterns generate discussion. Her visible finances aligned perfectly with what would be expected from a moderately successful small orchard operation, comfortable but not prosperous enough to attract attention. The resources required for her forensic work were channeled through sophisticated structures that even professional financial investigators would struggle to identify. The barn that she had renovated immediately upon arrival served as both agricultural workspace and forensic laboratory, with its exterior maintaining the weathered appearance of a typical New England farm building, while its interior contained equipment and resources that would have impressed professionals at federal crime laboratories. The renovation had been conducted by non-local contractors who were paid well for their discretion, with agricultural justifications provided for modifications that actually served her investigative work. The ventilation systems that appeared, designed for apple storage, actually accommodated specialized chemical analysis that couldn't be conducted in standard living spaces. The reinforced security features ostensibly protected valuable equipment and harvest yields, but actually safeguarded evidence and research materials. The enhanced electrical capacity that seemed excessive for typical farm operations powered sophisticated analytical devices that continued her forensic work long after her official career had been terminated. Most impressive was her adaptation. of agricultural equipment and materials for forensic purposes, allowing her to conduct advanced analyses using tools and supplies that could be purchased without raising questions. She modified standard microscopes with specialized lighting systems that could be disassembled and concealed when not in use, adapted fruit sorting equipment to automate certain aspects of evidence examination, and repurposed agricultural chemicals for forensic applications in ways that demonstrated extraordinary scientific creativity and technical ingenuity. She essentially built a world-class forensic laboratory using components that would appear completely normal in an agricultural setting, Dr. Catherine Morgan explained. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd see farm equipment with some unusual modifications. If you understood forensic methodology, you'd recognize one of the most innovative evidence analysis setups ever created outside of a formal laboratory environment. Elaine's daily schedule was structured to accommodate both her cover identity and her investigative work. The agricultural calendar provided perfect justification for periods of intense activity visible to the community, alternating with quieter periods, where her absence from public view wouldn't generate concern. During harvest seasons, she worked visibly in her orchard from dawn until dusk, establishing patterns that neighbors would notice and consider normal. During winter months when agricultural activity naturally decreased, she could focus on her forensic work without creating suspicious patterns of behavior or resource consumption. The challenge of continuing complex forensic investigation without institutional support or collaborative professional relationships would have defeated most scientists, but Elaine's methodical approach and extraordinary patience allowed her to make progress despite these limitations. She maintained contact with a small network of trusted former colleagues who had helped establish her new identity, communicating through encrypted channels and using protocols that protected both her location and their professional positions. This network provided access to official case files, emerging forensic methodologies, and occasionally, physical evidence that couldn't be obtained through other means. Their continuing belief in her work and commitment to justice sustained both her investigation and her spirit during years when progress was measured in incremental discoveries rather than dramatic breakthroughs. What made her approach unique was her willingness to think in decades rather than weeks or months, explained Dr. Morgan. Most criminal investigations operate under time pressure. Evidence degrades, memories fade, suspects flee. Eleanor understood she was playing a different game entirely. She was building a case that would eventually prove irrefutable, regardless of how long that process required. The truth was her only client, and truth doesn't get impatient. While maintaining her cover identity required significant effort and constant vigilance, the greatest challenge Elaine faced was emotional rather than operational. The isolation necessary for her security created a solitary existence that would have broken someone with less internal fortitude or clarity of purpose. She had abandoned her professional identity, severed connections with family and friends who believed she was dead, and accepted a life where meaningful human connection was sacrificed for the pursuit of justice. The psychological resilience required for that kind of long-term isolation is exceedingly rare, explained Dr. Robert Chun, a forensic psychologist who later evaluated her case. Most people would have either abandoned the mission or compromised their security through attempts to maintain emotional connections. The fact that she sustained both her investigation and her cover identity for nearly 30 years suggests an extraordinary psychological profile, a combination of absolute commitment to justice, exceptional self-sufficiency, and the ability to find meaningful purpose in work that might never be publicly acknowledged. What sustained Elaine through those decades of solitary purpose was visible in the journal she maintained, a document that served multiple functions in her complex life. On its surface, it appeared to be a standard farmer's log, recording weather conditions, agricultural decisions, harvest yields, and market prices with the detail and consistency that successful orchard management required. This visible portion of the journal provided both practical agricultural documentation and a cover for the more significant content concealed within its pages. Using techniques she had learned during her forensic career, Elaine maintained a parallel record written in specialized ink that remained invisible unless viewed under specific light conditions with appropriate filtering. This hidden journal documented her ongoing investigation, evolving theories, evidence analysis, connections to related cases, and the methodical dismantling of the protection network that had allowed Judge William Prescott to remain beyond the reach of conventional investigation. The journal revealed both her scientific brilliance and her human struggle, pages of meticulous forensic analysis interspersed with rare moments of personal reflection that acknowledged the weight of her isolation and the uncertainty of her chosen path. Yet even in these most private reflections, her resolve never wavered. The justice she sought wasn't personal vindication, but accountability for victims whose lives had been taken and then forgotten by systems designed to protect them. I think sometimes about Sarah Mitchell's parents. She wrote in one particularly poignant entry from 2003, more than 20 years after the first murder. They're elderly now, still believing their daughter's killer was never identified. They may die without knowing the truth, without seeing justice served. This is the true cost of corruption, not just the initial crimes, but the continuing wounds that never heal because truth remains hidden. There are days when the orchard seems like my only tangible accomplishment, the only place where my work produces visible results. But then I review the evidence file, see the patterns that become clearer with each new analytical approach, and remember why this matters. Justice delayed isn't justice abandoned. The investigation that Elaine continued from her rural Vermont orchard encompassed far more than the original Lakeside murders. As she analyzed evidence and connections, she discovered links to other unsolved cases throughout New England, patterns that suggested Judge Prescott's activities extended beyond the 5 officially connected victims to potentially dozens of other murders spanning 3 decades. More disturbing were the connections she methodically documented between Prescott and the officials who had protected him, relationships that encompassed law enforcement leadership, prosecutorial offices, and political figures whose careers had benefited from his influence and support. The network she uncovered wasn't a formal conspiracy but something potentially more insidious, a system of mutual protection based on shared interests, professional relationships, and institutional loyalties that prioritize stability and reputation over justice and accountability. What she was mapping wasn't just a serial killer's activity, but the anatomy of institutional corruption, explains Special Agent Hernandez. She documented how cases were redirected, evidence mishandled, investigations undermined through subtle administrative actions rather than explicit obstruction. It was a masterclass in how power protects itself not through dramatic conspiracy, but through the accumulated weight of small decisions made by people who often don't recognize their own complicity. Elaine's methodical approach extended to building a case that could eventually be presented through channels that wouldn't be vulnerable to the same influences that had blocked her original investigation. She created multiple copies of her evidence and analyses stored in locations unknown to each other, with instructions for distribution if she died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. She established verification protocols that would allow her findings to be authenticated by independent experts, and she documented chain of custody for every piece of evidence with the same rigor she had applied during her official forensic career. Her patience and thoroughness eventually intersected with changing circumstances that created new opportunities for her work to reach the proper authorities. In 2018, Judge William Prescott died of natural causes at age 78, triggering obituaries that celebrated his judicial career and philanthropic activities without hint of the darkness Elaine had spent decades documenting. His death removed the central figure whose influence had orchestrated the protection network, creating vulnerabilities in the system that had maintained silence for so long. Simultaneously, broader cultural shifts had transformed the landscape of accountability for powerful figures. The #MeToo movement had demonstrated that long-hidden misconduct could eventually face public reckoning. Institutional responses to evidence of abuse had begun prioritizing transparency over reputation management, and advances in forensic technology had created new possibilities for analyzing evidence that had previously yielded insufficient results. Elaine recognized these converging factors as the opportunity she had been preparing for throughout her years of solitary investigation. After careful consideration of potential approaches, she initiated contact with Melissa Carpenter, a journalist whose investigative work on cold cases and institutional corruption had demonstrated both professional rigor and ethical commitment. Using encrypted communication channels that protected her identity, Elaine provided initial documentation that established the credibility of her information while maintaining the security of her full investigation. "The first communication was like nothing I'd ever received," Carpenter later recalled. Meticulously organized evidence about the Lakeside Strangler case, including details that had never been publicly released, analytical approaches I'd never encountered, and connections to other unsolved murders that made perfect sense once they were explained, but had never been officially linked. The documentation was labeled as coming from Eleanor Whitfield's continuing investigation, a person who had supposedly died hiking in the White Mountains almost 30 years earlier. This initial outreach began a months-long collaboration, conducted entirely through secure digital channels, with Elaine gradually sharing more extensive documentation while maintaining the security of her identity and location. Carpenter's journalistic investigation corroborated key aspects of Elaine's findings, identified additional connections that supported her conclusions, and eventually produced enough independently verifiable evidence to justify approaching federal authorities with the consolidated information. The decision to involve the FBI rather than state or local agencies reflected Elaine's strategic assessment of jurisdictional advantages and institutional vulnerabilities. The murders had occurred across state lines, potentially qualifying as federal cases under certain circumstances. More importantly, the corruption she had documented primarily existed within state and local systems, making federal investigation less vulnerable to the influence networks that had previously obstructed justice. When Carpenter presented the initial evidence package to the FBI's Boston field office in October 2021, the response was cautiously professional. The materials were obviously sophisticated and potentially significant, but came from an unverified source claiming to be a forensic scientist who had been presumed dead for decades. Standard procedure required verification before committing significant investigative resources. The turning point came when our laboratory analyzed the methodologies described in the documentation, explained Special Agent Hernandez. The analytical approaches were revolutionary but scientifically sound, demonstrating expertise that couldn't have been fabricated by someone without advanced forensic training. More convincingly, certain technical details matched unpublished research that Eleanor Whitfield had been conducting before her disappearance, work that was documented in laboratory records but never published or implemented after her presumed death. This verification prompted a more serious federal investigation, including attempts to identify and locate the source of the materials. For Elaine, this represented the most dangerous phase of her long mission, the period when her work was being taken seriously enough to generate active investigation, but before she had provided sufficient evidence to ensure that the truth about the Lakeside murders would be fully exposed regardless of her personal safety. She responded with characteristic methodical precision, gradually revealing additional evidence while maintaining security protocols that protected her location and identity. Over the following 6 months, she provided documentation that allowed federal investigators to identify previously unknown victims, locate evidence that had been misplaced or deliberately obscured, and reconstruct the network of influence that had protected Judge Prescott throughout his decades of predation. The strength of the case she had built over nearly 30 years gradually became undeniable, even to skeptical investigators who had initially questioned both the conclusions and their mysterious source. Forensic analysis of evidence she directed them to recover witness statements she had documented years earlier but had never been officially recorded, and financial connections she had methodically traced all converged to create a compelling case that couldn't be dismissed or suppressed. By April 2022, federal authorities had accumulated sufficient evidence to publicly acknowledge that they were reinvestigating the Fuzka, Lakeside Strangler cases and examining potential connections to other unsolved murders throughout New England. This announcement generated significant media attention, with coverage focusing on both the original murders and the institutional failures that had potentially allowed the killer to remain unidentified for decades. For Elaine, this public acknowledgement represented a critical milestone in her long journey toward justice. For the first time since she had been forced into hiding, official law enforcement agencies were publicly pursuing the truth she had spent decades documenting from her solitary orchard. The victims' families were finally receiving acknowledgement that the cases remained active, and that new approaches might bring long-delayed answers about who had taken their loved ones. Yet Elaine maintained her cover identity and continued her normal routines in Willow Creek, recognizing that the investigation remained vulnerable until irrefutable evidence was formally entered into, legal proceedings that would make suppression impossible. She continued her weekly visits to Wilson's General Store, worked visibly in her orchard as spring brought the seasonal increase in agricultural activity, and gave no indication to her neighbors that the nationally covered cold case had any connection to their reclusive local orchardist. What Elaine couldn't anticipate was that events beyond her control were about to converge in ways that would finally expose her extraordinary double life to the community that had unknowingly sheltered her for nearly 3 decades. The careful balance she had maintained between necessary visibility and protective isolation was about to collapse under circumstances that no operational security plan could have foreseen or prevented. On May 17, 2022, as Elaine was inspecting early apple blossoms in the furthest section of her orchard, she suffered a massive heart attack. The severity of the event left her unable to reach help, and her isolated location meant that no one witnessed her collapse or heard her calls for assistance. She lost consciousness in the orchard she had tended for 28 years, surrounded by the trees that had provided both livelihood and cover for her true life's work. When Elaine failed to appear for her regular Tuesday morning visit to Wilson's General Store on May 24th, Robert Wilson noted the uncharacteristic absence, but wasn't immediately concerned. Even Elaine occasionally varied her schedule during busy agricultural periods, he explained later. But when she missed the following Tuesday as well, it was so completely out of character that I felt something must be wrong. In 28 years, she had never missed 2 consecutive weekly visits without explanation. Wilson's concern prompted him to contact Sheriff Thomas Brennan, who had succeeded his father in the position 12 years earlier. Together, they drove to Elaine's property to conduct a welfare check, prepared to respect her privacy but determined to ensure her safety, given the unprecedented break in her established patterns. Their repeated knocks at the farmhouse door went unanswered, and a check of the visible portions of the orchard revealed no sign of activity. With growing concern, they made the decision to enter the home under emergency circumstances, breaking a window to access the locked door after announcing their presence and receiving no response. What they discovered inside would transform their understanding of the woman they had known for decades and expose one of the most extraordinary stories of professional dedication and personal sacrifice in the history of American criminal justice. Sheriff Thomas Brennan had entered countless homes during welfare checks throughout his law enforcement career, usually finding mundane explanations for missed appointments or unanswered calls. Sometimes residents had forgotten plans or changed schedules. Occasionally, they had suffered minor injuries or illnesses that prevented normal activities. In the worst cases, they discovered people who had passed away alone, a sadly common occurrence. In an aging rural community where many elderly residents lived in isolation, what he and Robert Wilson discovered inside Elaine Winters' farmhouse defied all expectations and immediately transformed their understanding of the woman who had lived among them for nearly 3 decades. The interior bore little resemblance to the neglected exterior that had discouraged visitors and reinforced Elaine's reputation for austere self-sufficiency. Instead of the Spartan living conditions they anticipated, they found a space that functioned as both comfortable home and sophisticated research facility. The living room walls were lined with bookshelves containing thousands of volumes on forensic science, criminal psychology, legal precedents, and investigative methodology, professional resources far beyond what anyone would expect from an apple farmer with no known background in law enforcement. One entire section of the house had been converted into what was clearly a forensic laboratory, with specialized microscopes, analytical equipment, and carefully organized evidence storage systems. A large table in the center of this room held case files, photographs, and detailed timelines connecting multiple murder investigations spanning more than 4 decades. Computer equipment more advanced than anything in the local sheriff's office occupied a dedicated workstation, with multiple screens displaying complex data analysis programs and case management software. It was like walking into another world. Sheriff Brennan recalled, "Everything we thought we knew about Elaine Winters disappeared in an instant. We weren't standing in a reclusive farmer's home. We were clearly inside an elaborate, private investigation facility operated by someone with professional training and extraordinary dedication." Their search for Elaine became more urgent as they realized the implications of what they were seeing. Moving through the house with growing concern, they eventually located her bedroom, where a medical alert device lay on the nightstand. Unused, the bed was neatly made, with no indication it had been slept in recently. A calendar on the wall had appointments marked through May 16th, with nothing noted afterward. As they continued their search of the property, the sheriff used his radio to request additional assistance, recognizing that they were dealing with circumstances far beyond a routine welfare check. When deputies arrived, he organized a systematic search of the extensive orchard property, dividing it into sections that could be thoroughly examined by the limited personnel available in the small rural department. Deputy Sarah Jenkins discovered Elaine's body in the northeastern section of the orchard, approximately half a mile from the house in an area of older trees that would have been undergoing spring inspection and maintenance. The evidence suggested she had suffered a medical emergency and been unable to summon help or return to the house where her emergency alert system might have saved her life. The medical examiner determined she had experienced a massive heart attack, Sheriff Brennan explained. She likely died within minutes, despite being otherwise in excellent physical condition for her age. The isolation that had protected her secrets ultimately prevented her from receiving medical assistance that might have saved her life. While the circumstances of Elaine's death were straightforward, the implications of what they had discovered in her home were anything but simple. The sheriff's department secured the property and initiated protocols for handling what was clearly a situation with potential connections to active criminal investigations. Sheriff Brennan contacted the state police for assistance, explaining the unusual circumstances without speculating about their significance. "I knew we had discovered something extraordinary," he later explained, "but I had no idea how significant it actually was. I just knew we needed to protect everything until we understood what we were dealing with." The journal that would ultimately reveal Elaine's true identity and life's work was discovered by forensic technicians from the state police, who who arrived the following day to process the scene. Unlike the elaborate hidden writing in her private records, this journal was deliberately placed on her desk with a cover note addressed to authorities upon my death. Inside was a letter that would change everything, not just for the people of Willow Creek, but for dozens of families who had waited decades for answers about murdered loved ones. "My name is Eleanor Whitfield," the letter began. "I did not die in the White Mountains in 1994, as officially recorded. I created the identity of Elaine Winters and established this operation in Willow Creek to continue my investigation of the Lakeside Strangler murders after official channels were corrupted to protect the perpetrator, Judge William Prescott. This journal provides guidance to the complete evidence package I have assembled over the past 28 years, documenting not only Prescott's crimes, but the network of protection that allowed him to escape justice despite compelling evidence of his guilt." The letter continued with precise instructions for contacting FBI Special Agent Marcus Hernandez, who had been working with journalist Melissa Carpenter on the recently reopened investigation. It provided authentication codes that would confirm the letter's legitimacy and detailed directions for accessing the complete research archive stored in multiple secure locations. "Should you be reading this due to my death or incapacitation," the letter concluded, "please know that my work contains sufficient evidence to conclusively identify Judge William Prescott as the Lakeside Strangler responsible for at least 18 murders between 1982 and 2014, with evidence suggesting his involvement in potentially dozens more. The documentation includes forensic analysis, witness statements never officially recorded, physical evidence that was deliberately mishandled or suppressed, and a comprehensive mapping of the protection network that prevented his prosecution. I have dedicated my life to ensuring this truth cannot remain hidden. Please ensure these victims finally receive justice." Sheriff Brennan immediately contacted the FBI number provided in the letter, setting in motion a sequence of events that would bring federal investigators to Willow Creek within hours and initiate one of the most extraordinary cold case breakthroughs in American criminal history. The revelation of Elaine Winters' true identity and the purpose behind her decades of isolation created shockwaves through the small community where she had lived as a deliberate stranger. For neighbors who had respected her privacy while occasionally wondering about her background, the truth was simultaneously shocking and strangely fitting, the pieces of a puzzle suddenly arranging themselves into a picture that made perfect sense in retrospect. All those oddities that never quite added up suddenly made complete sense, explained James Hawkins, whose family operated the neighboring orchard. Her scientific approach to agriculture that seemed too sophisticated for someone with her background. Her ability to analyze complex problems with methodical precision. Her awareness of her surroundings that went beyond normal attentiveness. We thought she was just an eccentric farmer with unusual skills. Now we understand she was applying professional investigative training to agriculture while continuing her real life's work in secret. The FBI team that arrived in Willow Creek was led by Special Agent Hernandez, who had been working on the reopened Lakeside Strangler investigation for the previous 7 months without knowing the true identity of their confidential informant. His initial examination of Elaine's research facility and the evidence she had assembled on site confirmed what the authentication codes had already suggested. They had indeed located Eleanor Whitfield, the brilliant forensic scientist whose apparent death had ended the original investigation nearly 3 decades earlier. What she accomplished without institutional support or professional collaboration is almost beyond comprehension, Hernandez explained to Sheriff Brennan as they coordinated the evidence collection process. She built a private forensic laboratory with capabilities that rival government facilities, maintained investigative momentum for nearly 30 years without colleagues or organizational resources, and assembled a case strong enough to withstand any legal challenge, all while successfully maintaining a cover identity and productive agricultural operation. I've never seen dedication like this in my entire career." The evidence Elaine had assembled extended far beyond the materials in her farmhouse. Following her detailed instructions, federal investigators located multiple secure storage facilities containing duplicate records, physical evidence she had, preserved according to strict chain of custody protocols, and comprehensive documentation of her investigative methodology that would allow her conclusions to be independently verified by other forensic experts. Most significant was the network of trusted former colleagues who had maintained contact with her throughout her years in hiding, providing access to official databases, emerging forensic technologies, and institutional resources that would have been otherwise unavailable to someone operating outside formal law enforcement structures. These professionals had risked their careers to support her continuing investigation, sharing her commitment to justice despite the personal and professional risks involved. She created a shadow investigative team that operated in parallel to official channels for nearly 30 years, explained Dr. Catherine Morgan, who had been one of Eleanor's closest professional allies throughout her hidden existence. Each of us contributed specialized expertise, access to different resources, or connections to information sources that Eleanor couldn't directly access without compromising her security. We operated independently, often unaware of who else was involved, connected only through secure communication protocols that Eleanor established and maintained. As federal investigators processed the evidence and reconstructed Eleanor Whitfield's extraordinary investigation, the community of Willow Creek struggled to reconcile their memories of the reclusive orchardist with the reality of the brilliant forensic scientist who had hidden among them for decades. The contrast between her public persona and private purpose created profound questions about perception, judgment, and the assumptions that shape community understanding. "We all thought we knew who she was," Robert Wilson reflected. "We had constructed a narrative that made sense of her behavior based on the limited information she allowed us to see. We accepted her preference for solitude as personal eccentricity rather than operational necessity. We respected her privacy without recognizing the purpose behind it. The story we told ourselves about Elaine Winters made perfect sense until we discovered it was completely wrong." This recognition prompted deeper reflection throughout the community about other neighbors, whose lives might contain complexities and purposes hidden beneath familiar routines and public personas. The revelation that someone could live among them for decades while concealing such extraordinary truth created both humility about the limits of social perception and appreciation for the depth that might exist beneath seemingly simple surfaces. "It makes you wonder what else we miss about the people around us," Martha Donovan observed during an impromptu community gathering at Wilson's General Store in the days following the discovery. Not that others are necessarily hiding dramatic secrets like Eleanor's, but that everyone has depths we never fully see, purposes, knowledge, experiences that shape their lives in ways we might never recognize if we judge solely by what's visible from the outside. As news of the discovery spread beyond Willow Creek, Eleanor Whitfield's story captured national attention, transforming the quiet scientist into a symbol of extraordinary dedication and moral courage. Media coverage focused on both the serial murder investigation she had continued in isolation and the personal sacrifices she had made to pursue justice when institutional systems failed. The families of the Lakeside Stranglers victims, many of whom had lived with unanswered questions for decades, responded with complex emotions to the revelation that one person had continued seeking justice long after official investigations had stalled. For some, the discovery brought renewed grief as they confronted memories long suppressed. For others, it provided a measure of comfort knowing that their loved ones had not been completely forgotten by the justice system, even if that system had been represented by a single determined individual rather than official institutions. "For 23 years, I believed no one was still looking for my daughter's killer," explained Richard Mitchell, whose daughter Sarah had been the Lakeside Strangler's first identified victim in 1982, to learn that someone had dedicated their entire life to finding justice for Sarah and the other victims, sacrificing their own identity, career, family connections, everything. It's overwhelming. How do you properly thank someone who gave up their entire existence to fight for truth when everyone else had moved on? Federal prosecutors worked methodically through the mountain of evidence Eleanor had assembled, building a comprehensive case that extended far beyond the original Lakeside murders. The documentation she had compiled revealed connections to at least 13 additional homicides that had never been officially linked to the same perpetrator, creating a picture of predation that spanned more than 3 decades and affected communities throughout New England. More disturbing were the connections she had mapped between Judge William Prescott and the officials who had protected him from investigation. Her methodical documentation revealed how investigations had been redirected, evidence mishandled, and witnesses discouraged through subtle pressure applied by figures whose careers had benefited from Prescott's influence and support. The pattern she uncovered wasn't a formal conspiracy, but a network of mutual protection based on professional relationships, institutional loyalties, and shared interests that had prioritized system stability over justice for victims. What Eleanor documented wasn't just a serial killer's activities, but the anatomy of institutional failure, explained Special Agent Hernandez during a press conference announcing the preliminary findings of the federal investigation. She showed how corruption operates not through dramatic conspiracy, but through accumulated, small decisions made by people who often don't recognize their own complicity. It's a case study in how power protects itself and how justice can be subverted without anyone explicitly choosing to obstruct it. 6 months after Eleanor Whitfield's body was discovered in her Vermont orchard, federal prosecutors announced formal conclusions connecting Judge William Prescott to 18 murders committed between 1982 and 2014, though Prescott had died. In 2018, preventing criminal prosecution, the evidence was presented in comprehensive public reports that provided long-delayed answers for victims, families, and accountability for the systems that had failed them. Several officials implicated in the protection network faced professional consequences and potential criminal charges for obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and other offenses related to their roles in preventing Prescott's crimes from being properly investigated. The broader examination of institutional failures prompted by Eleanor's work led to significant reforms in evidence handling protocols, cross-jurisdictional investigation procedures, and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar protection networks from forming in the future. For the people of Willow Creek, Eleanor Whitfield's extraordinary story created a profound reconsideration of the woman they had known as Elaine Winters. The community that had respected her privacy while occasionally wondering about her background now faced the challenge of honoring both her public life among them and the hidden purpose that had driven her isolated existence. She lived 2 lives simultaneously, both of them authentic in their own way, observed Margaret Caldwell during the memorial service held at the community center 3 weeks after Eleanor's identity was revealed. As Elaine Winters, she transformed a failing orchard into a model of sustainable agriculture, developed innovative growing methods that other farmers still use, and produced some of the finest apples in Vermont. As Eleanor Whitfield, she pursued justice with unparalleled determination when systems meant to protect victims instead protected a predator. Both lives represented extraordinary commitment, expertise. She excelled at everything she did, even when no one was watching. The memorial service reflected this dual legacy, with attendance divided between neighbors who had known her as the reclusive orchardist and law enforcement professionals who recognized her contributions to forensic science and criminal justice. FBI officials presented formal commendations acknowledging her extraordinary service, while local farmers spoke of her agricultural innovations and willingness to share knowledge despite her preference for solitude. The question of what would happen to Eleanor's property generated significant discussion throughout the community. With no known family members or will directing its disposition, the land might have been sold to satisfy tax obligations or transferred to state ownership. Instead, a coalition of former colleagues, victims' family members, and local residents established a foundation to preserve both aspects of her legacy. The Eleanor Whitfield Justice Foundation was created with donations from law enforcement organizations, forensic science associations, and individual contributors inspired by her extraordinary dedication. The foundation purchased the property from the state and transformed it into a dual-purpose facility that honored both dimensions of her remarkable life. The orchard continued as a working agricultural operation, maintained according to the sustainable methods Eleanor had developed and serving as a demonstration and teaching facility for regional farmers interested in environmentally responsible fruit production. The proceeds from apple sales supported scholarships for students pursuing careers in forensic science, with particular emphasis on individuals committed to working in rural areas where specialized resources were often limited. The farmhouse and barn were converted into an educational center focused on forensic science, cold case investigation, and the institutional reforms necessary to ensure that justice systems serve victims rather than protecting the powerful. Training programs brought law enforcement professionals from throughout the region to learn advanced investigative techniques, with particular emphasis on cases that cross jurisdictional boundaries or involve suspects with institutional connections. She would have hated the attention but approved of the purpose, Dr. Morgan observed during the center's dedication ceremony. Eleanor never sought recognition. She was willing to disappear completely to pursue truth. But she would appreciate knowing that her work continues through others who share her commitment to justice, especially for victims whose cases might otherwise be forgotten. The most powerful aspect of Eleanor's legacy emerged through the connections formed between the families of murder victims who had lived for decades without answers or accountability. As these families came together during the federal investigation and subsequent proceedings, they created support networks that acknowledged their shared experiences while advocating for systemic changes that might prevent similar failures in the future. Eleanor gave us more than just answers about who killed our loved ones, explained Susan Lawson, whose sister had been murdered in 1988 in a case that remained unsolved until Eleanor's evidence connected it to Judge Prescott. She showed us what one person with absolute commitment to truth can accomplish against systems designed to protect the powerful. Her example inspired us to transform our grief into action that might protect others, even if justice for our own families came too late. For the residents of Willow Creek who had known her only as the reclusive orchardist who avoided human connection, Eleanor Whitfield's true story prompted profound reflection about perception, judgment, and the assumptions that shape community understanding. They had constructed a narrative about Elaine Winters based on limited information, accepting her preference for solitude as personal eccentricity rather than recognizing the purpose behind her isolation. We thought she was running away from something, James Hawkins reflected. In reality, she was running toward justice with more determination than anyone I've ever encountered. While we were busy misinterpreting her silence as emptiness, she was pursuing a purpose greater than anything most of us will ever experience. This recognition created lasting changes in how the community perceived others whose lives might contain depths hidden beneath familiar routines and public personas. The knowledge that someone could live among them for decades while concealing such extraordinary purpose inspired both humility about the limits of social perception and appreciation for the complexity that might exist within seemingly simple lives. Eleanor taught us that heroism doesn't always announce itself, Sheriff Brennan observed. Sometimes it works quietly for decades without recognition or reward, driven by commitment to principles rather than desire for acknowledgement. She reminds us to look deeper, to consider that the people around us might contain worlds we never Imagine if we judge solely by what's visible on the surface. As pilgrims began visiting Willow Creek to learn about the woman who had sacrificed everything to pursue justice when systems failed, the community found itself navigating the tension between honoring Eleanor's extraordinary story and respecting the privacy she had valued throughout her life among them. They established boundaries that preserved the educational value of her legacy while preventing the sensationalism that would have horrified someone who had chosen anonymity as the price of continuing her essential work. "We owe her the dignity she always maintained," Robert Wilson insisted when tourism companies proposed Lakeside Strangler tours that would have commercialized her story. She didn't do any of this for attention or recognition. She did it because justice mattered more to her than personal comfort or professional advancement. The best way to honor that commitment is to ensure her story inspires others to similar dedication rather than becoming entertainment for the curious. In the years following Eleanor Whitfield's death and the revelation of her extraordinary double life, her legacy continued to evolve in ways that transformed both the small community of Willow Creek and the broader landscape of American criminal justice. What began as a shocking discovery in a reclusive farmer's home gradually developed into a movement that challenged fundamental assumptions about institutional accountability, cold case investigation, and the power of individual commitment. When systems failed to deliver justice, the Eleanor Whitfield Justice Center, established on the property where she had lived her hidden life for nearly 3 decades, became a nationally recognized facility for advanced training in forensic science and cold case methodology. Law enforcement professionals from across the country traveled to the converted farmhouse and barn, where Eleanor had conducted her solitary investigation, learning techniques she had developed in isolation that often surpassed those being taught in conventional settings. What makes Eleanor's approaches so valuable is that they were developed without institutional constraints or conventional assumptions, explained Dr. James Rodriguez, the forensic scientist who served as the center's first director. She wasn't limited by department budgets, jurisdictional boundaries, or established protocols. She created entirely new methodologies based solely on what would advance the investigation, regardless of precedent or tradition. That freedom produced innovations we're still working to fully implement within conventional systems. The center's most significant contribution emerged from Eleanor's methodology for analyzing connections between seemingly unrelated cases, an approach that had allowed her to identify 18 murders committed by Judge William Prescott when official investigations had connected only 5. This systematic cross-case analysis, which she had developed without institutional support or collaborative resources, became the foundation for a national database designed to identify patterns in unsolved homicides that might indicate serial predation across jurisdictional boundaries. The Whitfield Protocol, as it became known in law enforcement circles, had transformed cold case investigation throughout the country, leading to the resolution of more than 70 previously unsolved murders within the first 3 years of its implementation. More importantly, it had created new accountability mechanisms that prevented cases from being abandoned or suppressed when they involved suspects with institutional connections or political influence. Eleanor showed us that the most dangerous predators aren't necessarily those who avoid detection altogether, but those who operate within systems they understand well enough to manipulate, observed FBI Director Catherine Martinez during the protocol's formal adoption ceremony. Her work exposed not just one killer, but the network of relationships and institutional failures that protected him. The methodology she developed ensures that similar protection networks cannot operate undetected within modern investigative frameworks. For the families of murder victims whose cases had remained unsolved for decades, Eleanor's legacy provided more than just procedural improvements or statistical successes. The Survivors Coalition that formed in the aftermath of the Prescott revelations had developed into a powerful advocacy organization that transformed How victim families were treated during prolonged investigations and created support systems for those navigating the emotional challenges of cases that remained open for years or decades. Eleanor gave us more than justice for our loved ones. She gave us a model for transforming grief into purpose, explained Maria Delgado, whose sister had been killed in 1997 in a case Eleanor's evidence had eventually connected to Judge Prescott. Many of us had spent decades being gradually forgotten by investigative systems, treated as unfortunate reminders of unresolved cases rather than partners in seeking justice. Eleanor's example showed us how to become active participants in the process without sacrificing our emotional well-being or losing hope during extended investigations. The coalition established regional support groups throughout New England, connecting families experiencing similar circumstances and providing both emotional resources and practical guidance for navigating complex investigative systems. These groups created accountability mechanisms that prevented cases from being unofficially abandoned due to departmental priorities or resource limitations, ensuring that victims' families maintained connections with investigators even when active. Progress slowed during difficult phases. Most significantly, the coalition developed a mentorship program that paired family members of murder victims with law enforcement professionals, forensic specialists, and legal experts who provided guidance on constructive ways to advocate for continued investigation without creating adversarial relationships that might further complicate already challenging circumstances. This collaborative approach transformed how many departments interacted with victim families, creating partnerships that improved both investigative outcomes and emotional experiences for those most affected by violent crime. Eleanor showed us that advocacy and investigation aren't opposing forces, but complementary aspects of justice-seeking, explained Richard Mitchell, whose daughter's 1982 murder had been the first connected to Judge Prescott. For too long, we operated as though families pushing for answers were interfering with professional processes rather than contributing valuable perspective and motivation. The collaborative model we've developed based on Eleanor's example has resolved dozens of cases that might otherwise have remained open indefinitely. In Willow Creek itself, Eleanor's legacy manifested in more intimate ways that reflected both her public identity as the reclusive orchardist and her hidden purpose as a determined investigator. The community that had respected her privacy while occasionally wondering about her background now found itself navigating the complexities of honoring both dimensions of her remarkable life without sacrificing the dignity she had maintained throughout her years among them. The orchard continued as a working agricultural operation, maintained according to Eleanor's meticulous records and sustainable methods. The heritage and crimson gold apple varieties she had cultivated became regional specialties, with proceeds from their sale supporting both the Justice Center's educational programs and scholarships for students pursuing careers in forensic science or agricultural sustainability. She excelled at everything she committed herself to, observed James Hawkins, who helped manage the orchard's continued operation. These trees produced exceptional fruit because she applied the same methodical precision to their care that she brought to her investigative work. Maintaining them according to her methods honors not just what she accomplished, but how she accomplished it, with absolute dedication to excellence even when no one was watching. The annual Willow Creek Harvest Festival, which had existed for generations before Eleanor's arrival in the community, was expanded to include an educational component focused on both sustainable agriculture and ethical justice systems. The event attracted visitors from throughout the region who came to learn about Eleanor's dual legacy, while experiencing the rural community that had unknowingly sheltered her remarkable work for nearly 3 decades. We're careful to maintain an appropriate balance, explained Margaret Caldwell, who coordinated the festival's educational programming. This isn't about sensationalizing tragedy or exploiting Eleanor's story for tourism. It's about honoring the principles she lived by: commitment to truth, dedication to purpose, and the willingness to pursue what's right even when conventional systems fail. We focus on the values her story represents rather than the details of the crime she investigated. This thoughtful approach reflected the community's evolving understanding of Eleanor's complex legacy and their own role in the extraordinary story that had unfolded among them. Initial reactions of shock and disbelief had gradually transformed into deeper reflection about perception, judgment, and the assumptions that shape community understanding. They had constructed a narrative about Elaine Winters based on limited information, accepting her preference for solitude as personal eccentricity rather than recognizing the purpose behind her isolation. We thought we knew her based on what we could see, Robert Wilson reflected 3 years after the discovery of Eleanor's true identity. Now we understand how little we actually saw and how completely we filled in the blanks with our own assumptions. That recognition has changed how many of us think about the people around us. Not just potential hidden mysteries, but the depth and complexity that might exist within lives that seem simple on the surface. This perspective shift created lasting changes in how the community approached newcomers and longtime residents alike. While respecting privacy remained a core value in the rural Vermont town, there was a new appreciation for the potential depth beneath quiet exteriors and the purposes that might drive seemingly unusual choices. The story of the reclusive orchardist, who had actually been conducting one of the most remarkable cold case investigations in American history, had demonstrated how completely public perceptions could miss the reality of a life dedicated to hidden purpose. Eleanor taught us to question our assumptions without violating boundaries, Sheriff Thomas Brennan observed. We don't need to know everyone's secrets to recognize that each person contains depths we may never see. That understanding creates both humility about our judgments and appreciation for the complexity each person brings to our community, whether they share it openly or hold it privately. This philosophical impact extended beyond Willow Creek as Eleanor's story spread through media coverage, documentary films, and the best-selling book The Orchard's Secret, written by journalist Melissa Carpenter, who had been Eleanor's first contact when she began sharing her investigation with authorities. While some treatments sensationalized the more dramatic aspects of the case, the most thoughtful examinations focused on the broader implications of one woman's extraordinary commitment to justice when institutional systems had failed. What makes Eleanor Whitfield's story so compelling isn't just the serial murder investigation or her decades of hidden purpose, observed Dr. Catherine Morgan during a national symposium on forensic science and institutional accountability. It's that she forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how justice systems function when they're tested by cases that threaten powerful interests or institutional reputations. She demonstrated that accountability sometimes requires working outside systems that have been compromised by the very influences they're meant to check. This perspective generated significant debate within law enforcement and judicial communities, where Eleanor's methods raised complex questions about protocols, oversight, and institutional reform. Some professionals viewed her solitary investigation as a troubling precedent that undermined formal systems and established procedures. Others saw it as a necessary response to specific institutional failures that highlighted the need for more robust accountability mechanisms and protection for internal whistleblowers. Eleanor's approach was simultaneously inspiring and concerning, acknowledged FBI Director Martinez. No functional justice system should require someone to sacrifice their entire life and identity to ensure that murder victims receive the investigations they deserve. The fact that she felt this was necessary represents a catastrophic institutional failure that we must acknowledge and address. Her extraordinary actions were both a triumph of individual commitment and an indictment of systems that made such sacrifice necessary. This recognition led to significant reforms in how potential conflicts of interest were managed in criminal investigations, particularly those involving suspects with connections to law enforcement, judicial systems, or Political structures. New protocols established external review requirements for cases where internal influences might compromise investigative integrity, creating accountability mechanisms that prevented cases from being quietly abandoned when they threatened institutional interests or powerful individuals. More fundamentally, Eleanor's story prompted deeper examination of the cultural and organizational factors that allow protection networks to form within justice systems. Academic researchers studied the Prescott case as a model of how institutional corruption operates not through dramatic conspiracy, but through accumulated small decisions made by people who often don't recognize their own complicity in maintaining systems that protect power rather than pursuing truth. What Eleanor documented wasn't just one judge's crimes, but the anatomy of institutional failure, explained Dr. Elizabeth Chun, whose research on organizational ethics had been transformed by access to Eleanor's meticulous records. She showed how corruption operates through relationship networks, shared interests, and cultural assumptions that prioritize institutional stability over justice for victims. Understanding these mechanisms is essential for creating systems that can resist similar influences in the future. This academic work translated into practical reforms that transformed how law enforcement agencies and prosecutorial offices addressed potential conflicts of interest, managed cases involving high-profile suspects, and protected internal reporting mechanisms for professionals who identified potential misconduct or improper influence. While these structural changes couldn't eliminate all potential for corruption, they created significantly more robust safeguards against the systematic protection of powerful predators like Judge William Prescott. For forensic scientists like Dr. Rodriguez, who had studied Eleanor's methodologies and incorporated them into training programs at the Justice Center, her most valuable legacy was demonstrating how innovative approaches could advance investigations that had stalled under conventional protocols. Her willingness to develop entirely new analytical methods when established techniques failed had transformed how the field approached challenging cases, particularly those that crossed jurisdictional boundaries or extended over prolonged timeframes. Eleanor wasn't constrained by, "That's how we've always done it," thinking. Dr. Rodriguez explained to students during a training session at the center. She evaluated each analytical challenge based solely on what would advance the investigation, regardless of precedent or established protocols. That freedom to innovate, combined with absolute rigor in documentation and methodology, produced breakthroughs that wouldn't have been possible within conventional frameworks. This commitment to both innovation and methodological integrity became the center's guiding philosophy, attracting professionals who sought to develop new approaches to challenging cases while maintaining the scientific rigor necessary for legal proceedings. The facility's unique combination of cutting-edge technology and rural isolation, mirroring Eleanor's own working conditions, created an environment where investigators could step outside conventional thinking while remaining focused on practical applications that would advance real-world cases. For the families of murder victims whose cases had remained unsolved for decades, Eleanor's example provided something perhaps even more valuable than methodological innovations or institutional reforms. Her unwavering commitment over nearly 30 years demonstrated that justice need not be abandoned simply because conventional timeframes had expired or institutional attention had moved elsewhere. Eleanor showed us that time limits on justice are artificial constructs that we can choose to reject, Maria Delgado explained during a Survivors Coalition meeting. She refused to accept that cases become less important or victims less deserving, simply because years have passed without resolution. That perspective transformed how many of us approach our own advocacy and how we support others facing similar circumstances. This refusal to abandon pursuit of truth, despite institutional obstacles or extended timeframes, inspired a generation of advocates, investigators, and legal professionals who brought renewed attention to cases that might otherwise have remained permanently unresolved. Cold case units throughout the country incorporated Eleanor's methodologies and philosophical approach, recognizing that the passage of time created not just challenges, but also opportunities as witnesses' circumstances changed. New technologies emerged, and protection networks that had once shielded perpetrators gradually weakened. 5 years after Eleanor's death, the impact of her hidden work had extended far beyond the 18 murders directly connected to Judge William Prescott. The methodology she had developed had contributed to the resolution of more than 200 previously unsolved homicides throughout the country, bringing long-delayed answers to families who had lived with uncertainty for decades and creating accountability for perpetrators who had believed themselves beyond the reach of justice. More broadly, her story had transformed cultural understanding of cold cases and the professionals who pursue them, challenging the perception that unresolved investigations represented inevitable limitations of justice systems rather than opportunities for continued commitment and innovative approaches. Television dramas, documentary series, and journalistic coverage increasingly portrayed cold case investigation as an ongoing moral obligation rather than a specialized assignment with limited prospects for success. Eleanor Whitfield fundamentally changed how we think about justice delayed, observed Supreme Court Justice Michael Lawson during a judicial conference focused on cold case jurisprudence. She demonstrated that time alone need not defeat truth, that institutional obstacles can be overcome through determined effort, and that victims deserve continued commitment regardless of how many years have passed without resolution. That perspective has profound implications for how we approach not just murder investigations, but all aspects of our justice system. In Willow Creek itself, Eleanor's legacy continued to evolve through the lives she had touched both as the reclusive orchardist and as the posthumously discovered investigator. Local students participated in educational programs at the Justice Center, learning about both forensic science and sustainable agriculture through hands-on experiences in the laboratory and orchard. She had maintained with equal dedication. What inspires me most about Eleanor's story isn't just what she accomplished, but how she maintained balance between purpose and practice, explained 17-year-old Sophia Jenkins, who participated in the center's student mentorship program. She pursued justice with absolute determination while also creating something tangible and sustainable through her orchard. She shows us that meaningful life doesn't require choosing between abstract principles and practical contributions. The most powerful legacy combines both. This integration of purpose and practice became the center's guiding philosophy, attracting visitors who sought to understand how Eleanor had maintained her remarkable dual existence and what her example might teach about living meaningful lives, even when circumstances prevent public recognition or institutional support. While some came seeking dramatic revelation or sensational details, most departed with deeper appreciation for the quiet heroism of sustained commitment and the dignity of work performed with excellence regardless of whether anyone is watching. Eleanor never sought recognition or reward. Robert Wilson observed during a community gathering marking the 5th anniversary of her death. She pursued truth because it mattered, maintained her orchard with excellence because quality mattered, and conducted herself with dignity because integrity mattered. None of these required external validation or public acknowledgement. She reminds us that meaningful purpose often unfolds beyond the spotlight, in quiet determination that may never receive the recognition it deserves. This understanding of Eleanor's legacy, focused on values rather than drama, principles rather than personality, guided how Willow Creek integrated her story into community identity without sacrificing the dignity she had maintained throughout her years among them. The annual scholarship program established in her name supported students pursuing careers in either forensic science or sustainable agriculture, reflecting the dual nature of her contribution and the integration of purpose and practice that had characterized her remarkable life. For professionals studying the Prescott case and Eleanor's methodologies, her most significant legacy was demonstrating the power of patient, methodical commitment in an era often characterized by immediate results and public recognition. Her willingness to think in decades rather than days, to pursue truth without guarantee of success, and to sacrifice personal comfort for principled purpose, represented a counterpoint to cultural assumptions about achievement and validation that transformed how many approach their own professional challenges. Eleanor Whitfield forces us to reconsider how we measure meaningful work and successful lives. Dr. Elizabeth Chun observed during the dedication of a new laboratory wing at the Justice Center. She pursued purpose that might never have been recognized during her lifetime, maintained commitment without external validation, and measured success by fidelity to truth rather than public acknowledgement or institutional advancement. That perspective challenges our conventional understanding of achievement and invites us to consider deeper measures of meaningful contribution. This philosophical impact extended beyond those directly connected to criminal justice or forensic science, inspiring people in various fields to reconsider their own definitions of meaningful work and successful lives. Eleanor's story resonated particularly with those whose contributions often went unrecognized: caregivers, educators, environmental stewards, and others whose work created value that might not be immediately visible or publicly celebrated, but formed the essential foundation of community well-being and sustainable progress. What moves me about Eleanor isn't just her extraordinary investigation, but her willingness to find purpose beyond recognition, explained Diane Wilson during a community discussion about legacy and meaning. She reminds us that the most important work often happens beyond public view, that validation can come from commitment to principles rather than external acknowledgement, and that a life focused on truth and justice creates meaning regardless of whether others recognize its value during our lifetime. As visitors continued arriving in Willow Creek, seeking to understand the woman who had sacrificed everything to pursue justice when systems failed, the community maintained its commitment to honoring both dimensions of her remarkable life without sensationalizing tragedy or exploiting her story for attention. The educational programs at the Justice Center focused on the principles and methodology she had developed rather than the gruesome details of the crime she had investigated, creating a legacy that emphasized constructive purpose rather than darkness overcome. The orchard continued producing exceptional apples according to the sustainable methods Eleanor had developed, maintaining her agricultural legacy while supporting the educational and advocacy work that extended her commitment to justice beyond her lifetime. The heritage varieties she had cultivated, some nearly lost before her careful preservation, became symbols of continuity and renewal, representing how forgotten value could be rediscovered and preserved through dedicated attention and principled care. Eleanor saved these heritage varieties because she recognized worth that others had forgotten. James Hawkins explained to visitors touring the orchard. She applied that same perspective to murder victims whose cases had been abandoned, recognizing value that deserved continued commitment regardless of how much time had passed or how many obstacles stood in the way of resolution. In both her public work and her hidden purpose, she refused to accept that anything of true value should be abandoned simply because preserving it required extraordinary effort. This integration of agricultural preservation and justice-seeking created a uniquely powerful legacy that connected abstract principles to tangible reality, demonstrating how commitment to truth could manifest in both solving decades-old murders and preserving nearly extinct apple varieties. The Eleanor Whitfield Justice Center embodied this dual purpose, maintaining both laboratory facilities for advanced forensic training and working orchards that demonstrated sustainable agricultural methods developed through the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her investigative work. Eleanor's legacy isn't just about criminal justice or agricultural preservation. observed Sheriff Thomas Brennan during a training session for rural law enforcement officers. It's about recognizing that meaningful purpose often requires sustained commitment beyond conventional timeframes or immediate recognition. She shows us that justice delayed need not be justice abandoned, that truth matters regardless of how long its pursuit requires, and that principles maintain their value even when systems designed to protect them fail. As the 6th anniversary of Eleanor's death approached, her story continued inspiring people who might never visit Willow Creek or work in fields directly connected to her dual legacy. The quiet farmer who never spoke to anyone, yet posthumously solved one of the most significant serial murder cases in American history, had become a symbol of how extraordinary purpose can exist within seemingly ordinary lives, how determined individuals can overcome systemic obstacles, and how truth retains its value regardless of how long its pursuit requires or what personal sacrifices that pursuit demands. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.